Good evening all and welcome. Tonight we have a collection of deep woods, camping and cabin stories for your listening pleasures with the sound of accompanying rain. I hope you enjoy. Also, huge news, our new merch has just launched. If you're interested in picking up some exclusive Mortis Media apparel that is fresh off the press, feel free to grab some, link in the description. But for now, it's time to get comfortable. Pull out your umbrellas and let the darkness take control. Around the Great Depression, my great-grandfather decided it would be a good idea to build a second home. Why? I have no idea. But he did. He decided upon Vermont, as it's not too far a ride from his house in Woodbridge. But it was far enough that he felt as though he was always away. He found a plot at the end of Coham Road in South Londonderry, next to the Windle River, and over the years built himself and our family a beautiful oversized log cabin. Now, years later, I come along, and around the time I was 6. In 1995, he passed away, leaving the home to my grandmother. We would go up and make our best effort once a winter at skiing. It always ended poorly. Clearly we're not a skiing family. But the times when we truly loved the home was in the summer. It was always a little cooler in Vermont and absolutely beautiful. Far less people, as well as the proximity to the river was sublime. It was literally in our side yard. My aunt spent many years living there alone, but she always refused to tell us any stories out of fear we would not return. Unfortunately, my little sister declared around the age of 14 she would never return, but refused to tell us why. She said we would never believe her. So that leaves us with my experiences. The house was always kept in perfect, spotless condition, and my aunt had furnished it in a very cool way with lots of interesting antiques and cool old signs. It had the Vermont look, you could say. Nothing creepy about it whatsoever, but at the same time you could always feel a presence about the house. It was clear to us the spirits of my great-grandparents were still around. The usual stuff. Footsteps at night, doors opening and closing by themselves, the occasional apparition out of the corner of your eye. Seeing as we were sure this was just our great-grandparents, we felt no fear. In fact, it was almost comforting knowing they were still around and perhaps even enjoying our company. For me, however, the scary stuff was what was outside the house. We were maybe half a mile, if not a little more, from the nearest house, and others in our yard and the river, where we were surrounded by thick dark wood. Many nights I would lie in bed and hear a menacing, almost quiet growl in the woods behind the room I slept in. On the rare occasion I would be brave enough to peek out the window, I would often notice a pair of glowing eyes. I could only ever glance so briefly. I was never able to make out a body or size, but I'm sure it was there. In the mornings, I would always go back and check out, but there was never anything. No footprints or crushed plants, nothing. As I grew older and was allowed more freedom to explore, I would spend my days riding my bike along the dirt road, sometimes going beyond our dead end down the old access trail to the Windhall Brook campground to see if there were any other kids my age to hang out with and perhaps explore the woods even more. I will never forget riding down the trail on a beautiful summer day and noticing it getting darker and darker, colder and colder. But still my naive self carried on. I began hearing footsteps in the woods above me every so often, a branch snapping and a crack echoing through the valley. Every time I stopped, the woods grew silent again. I picked up my pace, continuing towards the campground, thinking my mind is playing tricks on me, and that cryptids and the like do not exist, and that I need to stop worrying. Sure enough, The second I had calmed back down, I saw the eyes in the woods again, and I saw no silhouette, shape, figure, nothing but darkness and eyes. Now, as you can imagine, you might have guessed I straight booked it and pedaled harder and faster than I ever had in my life, and made it to that campground quicker than anyone who has ever come before me. And I sat in the campground for hours, scared of what might happen to me on my bike ride home. But nothing did. The path was bright, the air was warm, and the birds were chirping. Needless to say, it took a few years for me to do the ride again, and I was no fool, and made sure I wasn't alone when I did it. Now the river. The river was always interesting. It clearly had a soul. It was more than just water meandering through rocks, it had character. Over the years it had sworn perfectly smooth channels in the rocks, creating beautiful, natural and immaculate water slides. There were perfect little pools one could sit in and read books for hours on the side of as well. It was like our own little amusement park. Now, on to some of the weird stuff. It seemed like every morning there would be these towers of river rocks built on stones throughout the river. Now these stones were identical to the ones we'd see alongside our road as we'd drive to and from the house, always round the river rocks, tapering down in size with the largest at the bottom. They probably ranged in size from a foot or two in height. I always just assumed it was the locals doing Vermont stuff. Not a wild superstition, but some of them do some strange things. The river ones were strange because it required swimming and a lot more effort to make, and even if you knocked them down at sunset, they would be back up at sunrise. We're not destructive people, so it's not like it was a thing to knock them down every day, but sometimes they'd fall while we were playing, and sometimes we would use the rocks as skipping stones, as they would be perfect for it. But the little rock towers would always come back. One hot and humid July day when I walked down by myself to the edge of the river, we had a rule that you weren't allowed to swim alone, as sometimes the currents could get strong, and if you really wanted to swim bad enough, it was always easy to get someone to accompany you. I was sitting at the river's edge, splashing my feet in the water and collecting stones for skipping, when I began to hear rustling on the other side of the river. I looked and looked, but couldn't see anything. Eventually I had forgotten about the rustling and began skipping the stones again. But the rustling began anew, followed by sticks crackling. Yet again curiosity got the best of me, and I began following the noise down the river. I came across the foundation of the old logging bridge. Nothing new or special, just 3 large stone piers, one on either side of the river, and one in the center. It was here that I stopped following the noise, as we always used the bridge as a kind of end of our zone. But as I did, I noticed movement by the pier on the far side of the river, and large stones began rolling through the trees down towards the river. Again it began to get chilly and quiet, nothing like the previous time on the trail. A location I was not far from, but it was like a cold wind, and if the woods had a dimmer switch and someone was slowly dimming it. I stood silently for a few minutes until I was sure whatever it was gone before trying to silently walk back towards the house. And again as I did, it warmed up and the birds began chirping, and by the time I was back, it was as if nothing had happened. As I grow older, I often wonder perhaps if the spirits of my great-grandparents had stuck behind to protect us from whatever was in those woods. There was certainly something strange going on there. So I went camping this one time with my friend. It was 10 p.m. and I really needed to go. I left our site and used the restroom, which is about 1/4 mile away. It's pitch dark, and as I'm walking I see one of my friends who was walking with us from a path leading to an unused site onto the main path. This unused site path was a good 50 yards away from our site path. My friend has a very noticeable and peculiar gait, so I knew it was him. At multiple points he turned around and asked, "Why are you following me?" Always a good 40 or so feet ahead of me. I would reply, I literally told you guys I was going to the bathroom. And question, why did you come from a different site? He picked his pace up and I eventually lost him in the darkness. I get to the restrooms without seeing him, do my business, and upon returning to my site, where he of course is, I start asking him why he's messing with me. Everyone denied that my friend even left. Okay, so they're messing with me. No big deal. 3 a.m. rolls around. I need to pee. No need to walk to the restrooms this time. I just walk off into the woods. And as I walk back after I take a leak, I hear the distinct sound of a tent zipper opening. In the darkness I can tell it's my friend. Then I can barely see but definitely hear him zip it back up. As I get closer to the tents I see him more clearly and he walks a bit, goes to light a cigarette and I can see his face in the flint strikes of the lighter. And even clearer still when he manages to catch it. He lights his cigarette, takes a puff and says, "Can you hear me?" "Yeah, I can hear you, what's up?" He then repeats himself, "Can you hear me?" "Yeah, are you trying to wake everyone up, dude?" He shakes his head at me, then turns around and walks towards the cars, maybe 30 feet away from him. I'm thinking he's messing with me again. I gotta follow but lose him behind a car. I turn the corner and he's nowhere to be seen. I'm annoyed. He thinks he's so funny, so I go back to his tent, which is still closed, and I can still hear him faintly snoring inside. I don't know what I saw, but it looked exactly and sounded exactly and walked exactly like my friend. I was slightly inebriated, but not enough to hallucinate. He denies he ever left his tent, or went through the woods ahead of me. My parents own a small cabin in the middle of the woods, on about 60 acres of land in upstate New York, rural Sullivan County to be a bit more precise. We call it, rather appropriately, the camp. The small cabin at the camp is nicely nestled in the middle of the woods. There's a mile-long dirt road surrounded by woods that leads to a small dirt lot and a small yard in front of the building. We use this road to get to and from the camp. Behind the cabin is a clearing that is about 350 yards long and 60 yards wide. The clearing consists of the backyard, the garden, and the end of the yard, and a small field directly behind it. Other than that, the rest of the property is all woods. Woods that we have explored thoroughly, but a vast amount of woods nonetheless. The cabin is made up of only 2 rooms, with one room used as the bedroom and the other used as the living area. There is only one inside wall within the cabin, and its simple purpose is to divide the 2 rooms. Other than that, the 2 rooms are completely open. The cabin had simple furnishings. In the bedroom there was a bunk bed, a sofa couch, and in the living area there was a love seat, a sofa couch, a wooden stove, 2 dressers, a coffee table, a rocking chair, and a small TV. That's it. No kitchen, no bathroom. We used a gas-powered generator to run the few lights and outlets within the cabin, as well as the TV. We had a VCR hooked up to the TV and would occasionally watch movies on VHS or DVD. For those concerned about the bathroom situation, there was an outhouse about 30 yards from the cabin. To cook, we either used the wood stove inside the cabin or the propane grill on the small porch overlooking the backyard. The cabin has multiple windows. There is a fair-sized window that allows us to view the front yard. Another fair-sized window on the side of the building that gives us a view of the woods, and a large picture window at the rear end of the cabin that gives us a view of the backyard, garden, and field. These windows are all in the living area. There are 2 small windows in the other room of the cabin, but they are not relevant. Myself, my younger brother by about 3 years, and my mother and father spent just about every weekend at the camp when we were younger. Simply put, we grew up in the woods and were certainly no strangers to the outdoors. With that being said, I've had my fair share of experiences, most of which had logical explanations. However, the event you're about to hear stands out, because to this day, not one of us can explain it. This took place in summer of 2008. I was 9 years old at the time. It was a perfectly normal Saturday in June. My brother and I carried out a normal routine of riding four-wheelers, playing outside, catching frogs and salamanders. Nothing out of the ordinary throughout the day, as you would expect. Towards the evening, it started getting a bit chilly. So my brother and I decide to call it a day and head inside the cabin for the night. I gassed up and started the generator, and we went inside for the evening. Once inside, I filled up the wooden stove and started the fire to get some heat going, as it was going to be a rather chilly night. My dad had just finished grilling the usual chicken, potatoes and burgers, as he brought the food inside at around 7 p.m. We all ate and relaxed for a little while to let our food settle. The sun had just started to set. Fast forward about half hour and I started to get bored. My mother then reminds me that she had brought my plug-and-play Wheel of Fortune game with us to play. I excitedly went and plugged the RCA cables into the TV and set up the game. The TV was situated just to the left of the big picture window, at the rear end of the building. It was dusk at this point. By dusk I mean it was getting darker, but there was still plenty of light to see outside. It was about 8:30 p.m. at this point, in upstate New York. It isn't pitch black outside until around 9:30 in the middle of summer, so there was still plenty of light out. We'd been playing Wheel of Fortune for a few minutes at this point. I was sat just a few feet away from the TV in a rocking chair. My mother handed me the game back for my turn when it happened. Just as I spun the wheel of the game, this extremely bright purple flash of light emitted from just behind me, at the front of the building. I turned my whole body around to see what it was and noticed that my parents and brother had done the same. I immediately noticed that the front yard was engulfed in this extremely bright purple light. We all watched as this purple light moved through the front window of the cabin. Once inside, it completely lit up the interior of the building. We all sat motionless, moving, nothing but our heads as this mysterious bright purple light passed by us, then proceeded out the back picture window and into the backyard, lighting up everything in its path. The light then sped off through the yard towards the garden. We watched it pass through the garden, then through the field, and just like that, disappeared into the woods. This all transpired within a few seconds. I dropped the game as I was in shock, and I turned around towards my parents, and already knowing their answer, nervously asked, "Did you see that?" They nodded, yes, in unison. My little brother ran over to the sofa my parents were on, and sat between them. I quickly followed his lead. In the hours that followed, nothing else happened. That was out the ordinary. I asked my dad what he thought the purple light was, and he told me he didn't know. My mother suggested it may have been lightning, which we all, including her, shut down as soon as the suggestion left her tongue. There was no way that the light was lightning. I have experienced many thunderstorms in my life, even at 9 years old, and no bolt of lightning has ever come close to replicating the appearance of the bright purple light. We all slept in the living area that night, my mother and myself on the sofa, and my little brother and father on the love seat. We openly talk about that strange purple light to this day, and still not one of us has any idea what we experienced or has experienced anything like it again. We still spend a lot of our free time at the camp, as I mentioned. I have experienced many other things over the years, but never anything like the light. I have researched logical explanations such as ball lightning, and I've even researched paranormal phenomena such as orbs, but nothing has ever come close to match the appearance of that bright purple light that seemed to form from nothing. I grew up in a rural community in southern Ontario. It was one of those places where everyone wears camo, and when deer hunting opens, everything becomes deserted. As a kid, I spent the majority of my time in my forest playing alone, as my sisters weren't too fond of leaving the house, and my closest friend lived a few kilometers away. My favorite pastime was finding anything I could hit things with: stick, axe, hockey stick, and just run around the woods for hours practicing my combat skills against those poor and defenseless trees. Every day my bus would drop me off at 2:55, giving me lots of time to defeat my wooden enemies before my parents returned at 5:30. And once it was summer, I was out there from the moment I woke up. But I was always sure to be back and in the house before my parents got home, so they couldn't catch me messing around with a splitting axe. This was my nightly routine from ages 9 to 13. By around age 13, the act started to get boring. I knew the forest like the back of my hand and finally had worked hard enough to buy an Xbox. One summer, the internet went out, ruining my game of Medal of Honor, so I decided to do the one thing I had done a million times before and go get lost in my forest. It was about 10:30 a.m. I knew I had plenty of time before Dad got home. This being southern Ontario, the only thing that I was remotely scared of were fishers, combined with the fact that I was no longer interested in fighting trees. I only brought with me my fancy pocket knife that I had obtained from my father's police cruiser. I ran into the forest, up the main path over a ridge, and scaled it like I had many times before. I was gone 20 minutes when things started to feel strange. For some odd reason, I felt like I was being watched. I had never seen anyone but my neighbors in my forest before, so I immediately tossed the idea aside, thinking that I was just being overreactive. I kept running for another 10 minutes when the feeling starts to get stronger. I suddenly felt as though I was somewhere I shouldn't be, as though the branches overhead started to get thicker and everything grew darker and quieter. Occasionally I would hear this strange sound, which was unlike an animal I'd ever heard before, but more like the bell on a bike with an odd echo to it, almost like a metallic cricket. I decided that I should probably head home and check the time on my phone. It was barely 11 a.m. It was then I realized I had no idea where I was. Keep in mind that I knew every inch of this forest, from the roads that border three sides to the lake that borders the other. I had hiked every inch of it numerous times before, yet I had no idea where I was. And then things began to get stranger. I looked down around my feet and saw a bunch of metal buckets and various other metal tools. This is when I heard a voice. It seemed like a child calling for me by name. The voice was light and seemed to flow effortlessly on the wind. In my panic, I assumed it was one of my sisters calling for me to come home, so naturally I called my sister's name back. When I got no response, I took up my phone and began calling. But this, being the middle of nowhere on the Canadian Shield, I had no service. I looked around and out of the corner of my eye saw something dart behind a tree. I looked around me and saw laying in the ground among the buckets a rusted red bicycle, like one you see from the 50s in an anti-nuke poster, and the bike seemed to be in one part of the forest that light was shining through, kind of staging it. I quickly opened my camera and took a picture, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. And then I heard it again, but this time the child sounded like they were almost singing my name, breaking it up at the syllables. I started to quickly walk away, hoping that I would end up anywhere but this area, but the voices seemed to follow me, and I kept seeing glimpses of something running behind the trees, keeping pace with me. So naturally, I started running as fast as I could. I ran as quickly as my legs could manage, not caring for the branches that would whip me in the face and eyes, and after 15 minutes of running, things started to look familiar. I ran down a massive hill and the trees started to become much more open and brighter. I slowed down and began to walk, too terrified to check behind me. Once the feeling of impending doom settled, I finally mustered the strength to turn around. The moment I turned around is a moment I will never forget. I turned behind me and through the trees and saw my house, as if I had been running away from it the entire time. Thinking that I must have just gotten turned around and was absolutely hating the idea of running back into the forest, I walked towards the house. As I was probably 100 meters from it, I heard a spine-chilling shriek emanating from the forest behind me, similar to the sound of a mountain lion screaming or raccoons fighting, but it was far louder and seemed to be coming from not just one place, but many at once. I sprinted the final steps to my house and did not turn back. As soon as I entered the house, I came face to face with my father, who was sitting at the kitchen table. I looked at the clock on the wall and saw it was 4:45 p.m. I have no idea what happened in the 5 hours between the time the photo was taken and the time I got home. All that I remember is it took me roughly 30 minutes to get in and 20 to get out. I went right into my room and stared at the photo on my phone, assuring myself it had happened, and that I had seen what I'd seen. This was almost 5 years ago. I still find myself looking at the photo to show myself it happened, and I didn't just go mad. After that day, I decided that I would not venture out into the forest alone, and started a new character on Skyrim to assure I wouldn't want to go outside even if the internet was down. My parents moved out of that house this past summer and into the city. I still love going outside and even found myself working in isolation camps in the middle of the Rockies this past summer. Yet I cannot go alone outside or past the calling range of a friend. I have no idea what occurred that summer. Nothing paranormal has ever happened to me before or since that date. The summer after my second year in high school, I went up to the Pike National Forest in Colorado for a summer field biology camp. It was pretty cool because I had never been camping prior. I had a small 2-man tent that I shared with my buddy from school. We had met this kid at camp and instantly became really good friends. His parents were loaded, and his tent, which was about 10 feet from ours, was huge, like a 10-person tent. The night before this incident, a huge windstorm blew through the valley and absolutely annihilated his huge tent. Mine was fine, it was low to the ground. Anyway, for the rest of the time he slept in our already packed tent. I slept closest to the door of the tent because I always have to pee in the middle of the night and didn't want to climb over people. So the night this all went down, I woke up, no idea what time it was, and went outside to the forest, peed and crawled back into the tent. I was laying there for a bit. There happened to be a lightning storm over my head, cloud to cloud. As I was watching the light illuminate my tent, I started hearing whispering. It was a female whispering back and forth. I tried to hear what it was saying, but it was inaudible. The whispering started to get closer and closer until it was right next to the tent, next to my right ear. It just stopped. I didn't hear anyone else walking or anything. Then all of a sudden, lightning lit up the tent and there were shadows of people being cast on the side of the tent. I just about crapped myself. That's right when the chanting began. It sounded like a different language, and all females, a bunch of them. I closed my eyes and slipped under my sleeping bag and put my hands over my ears. The next day at breakfast, we all went back to the tent to get changed, and the new guy who was now staying with us, "Pretty wild last night, right?" To which I responded, "The lightning." "No, the freaky-ass chanting." "I think this place is cursed or something," he said. So it wasn't just me. But it did help that someone else heard it, and we could talk about it. Now every time I go camping, I stop drinking all liquids 2 hours before I plan to sleep, so I don't wake up in the middle of the night and need to pee. Back in October of 1989, my mother and I went up to the western part of North Carolina for a week to see the leaves change color. We rented a cabin which was owned by the cousin of my brother's former high school band teacher who had retired several years earlier. The band director was more or less keeping watch over the place. He lived down the street, but it wasn't until Friday afternoon that we saw him. The cabin was somewhat in the wilderness, but it was near a main road. The band director had to go away for the weekend and was letting us know. We had the number of his cousin in case we needed any help. This was on Friday afternoon. Up until that time, the trip had been uneventful. Friday evening we went to a church dinner which was down the road. When we came back home it was already dark, and my mum started thinking about that we were the only ones on this road and we didn't know the nearest neighbour, which was a little unsettling. The moon wasn't full, but there was a light to it. We had separate rooms in the cabin. The power went out in the cabin shortly after we came home from the church dinner. Then my mother heard what sounded like footsteps, and she saw what appeared to be the outline of a hat. There was a man walking around near the cabin. Then, we saw this hat disappear by the woods. By this time, both of us are terrified that the man is going to come into the cabin and harm us. Both of us wondered if he had cut the power source, and I decided to sleep in the bed which was under my mother's room. We tried to sleep, and then were awoken by an owl howling. My mother could see the owl's eyes, which were looking into the window. The drape couldn't be closed the entire way, and the owl didn't take its eyes off my mum the entire night. The owl also hooted all night. My mother tried to ignore the owl, but its presence really unnerved her. The eyes really unnerved me. Neither of us could sleep, as every noise jarred us. It would be like, "What's that? What noise is that?" Every once in a while we would see the outline of the hat walking around the general area. Then it would go off into the woods. Both of us were freaked out at this point, but we weren't able to leave in the middle of the night. There were no phones in the cabin, and this was long before cell phones were in common usage. The power finally did come back on several hours later, or so it seemed. We were in the wee hours of the morning. Originally we were going to leave on Sunday, but left as soon as the sun came up on Saturday. A few days later my mother got a call from the band director. Apparently the man we saw was a mountain man, who was a handyman and had been trying to get the power back on for us. He was harmless, but neither the band director or his cousin had told us that he lived out in the woods. We hadn't seen this guy until Friday night when the power went out. Had we learned that, we wouldn't have left on Saturday. He had told the band director that we left a day early. We could laugh about being scared. It was a memorable night after all. This event happened to me around last summer, and it was probably the scariest story in my life, and I wanted to share it with you. Something I've realized growing up year by year is that the world can be an amazing place, but it is filled with some super sick people, and unfortunately I've seen that side firsthand. I am a very social person, and love the opportunity to hang with friends whenever I can. I'm also the type of person who is always looking for the next big thing. I guess I should tell you, I was 18 years old, male at the time of this story, and have a decent-sized friends group of both boys and girls. Throughout high school, we had done a lot of crazy stuff together. Being just out of high school, we wanted to do something insane before making our ways for college, and we all decided to go camping in the middle of nowhere for 3 days, for fun, and, for some miracle, all our parents thought it would be fine. So we had 6 people going. Me, my girlfriend Stephanie, my friend Brandon and his girlfriend Kaylee, and Stephen and his girlfriend Sarah. We had decided to have 3 different tents for each couple. The reason you could probably guess. Being a former Boy Scout, I was aware on everything we needed to survive for the 3 days. Food, water, and other essential supplies. Being the rebellious teenagers we were, we also stocked up on plenty of booze, as well as a bit of the green stuff for our fun getaway. So mid-July, we departed for our camping vacation. After hours of driving and driving down back roads, we eventually found a place that looked secluded, but not sketchy, like some horror stories. There were houses near, but not too close, and again, we weren't looking for a sketchy woods to camp. But unfortunately, there was no service. It took us about an hour to get everything set up. While the girls and Steve finished setting up camp, Brandon and I took a look around while fetching firewood. We eventually came across a cool-looking trail. We weren't too concerned because there weren't houses within a mile radius, and we assumed that those people had used these trails to hunt, which was big in this area. If you're wondering about our car, we drove a Honda Pilot, which was Steve's, that had plenty of room for us and our supplies. We parked the car right close to the site, so we had eyes on it at all times. The first night nothing much happened. We rolled a blunt, drank a bit, and called it a night. The next day we decided to explore the woods a bit, but Brandon and Kaylee stayed behind to watch the site and spend time together. We decided to go down the path we found earlier. Around 20 minutes down the path, Steve spots a metal fence. We approach it to find a cemetery. The cemetery looked old, but there were signs of activity there. And no, not voodoo or cults or anything like that. We mean flowers and notes. And beyond the cemetery we saw a bigger trail that had tire tracks and a half-assed parking lot for the cemetery. We ventured down the path a bit more to spot some deer, then head back because it's getting late. That night we really partied hard because we were to leave the next day and didn't want to return with extra beer nor the green stuff. Now this is the night that was the polar opposite of the other. The other night was peaceful and we assumed the same about this one. But boy were we wrong. Now, you would assume there would have been warning signs earlier in our trip, like a rusty knife on our path or foot tracks around our site. Nope, not at all. All of us woke up to a blood-curdling scream coming from Steve and Sarah's tent. We all heard the fabric being ripped by what we assumed to be something sharp. I guess Steve hit the guy really hard with his flashlight and was able to get both him and Sarah to the car. Now, here's the issue. Steve's tent is closest to the car, while the other two tents are closer to the trail. So to get to Steve's car, we had to get past whatever attacked Steve and Sarah. Luckily, all our drunken selves were gone before getting into his car as he yelled cemetery, and it clicked in my head. The trail on the other side of the cemetery. So I quickly grabbed Brendan, Kaylee, and Stephanie and start running to the trail. I used my phone flashlight to help me see. You might think why you would turn on your flashlight. Well, the last thing I wanted to do was to miss the cemetery and be lost in the woods with the guy who attacked Steve. Well, by the time we get to the trail, Steve and Sarah had gotten the hell out of there from the site, and we could hear the guy chasing us from several yards behind. We were able to find the cemetery rather easily. I hopped the fence first, and when we all get over, we notice Steve has not arrived yet, so we all hid in the cemetery. Luckily, to our advantage, it was pitch black by the time I turned my flashlight off, and we all hid in complete silence. My heart dropped when I heard the metallic shaking as if someone was climbing over the fence. The guy had tracked us down, probably due to the fact that Steve had yelled cemetery. We all stayed still as we heard the ground crunch as the guy took slow steps. When in fight or flight mode, you're capable of a lot more than you would think. Your brain puts on some high power alert stuff. The guy approached, and I realized I had my small Swiss Army knife in my pocket. As the guy's steps grew closer to me, when he was right about on top of me, I grabbed my utility knife and stuck it behind his leg. The guy tumbled to the ground with a shriek of pain and a metallic sound as he dropped his weapon. As soon as the pair of headlights came around the corner, Steve had made it, and we all ran to the car. While I got up, the light gave me a glimpse of the guy. He was tall, bulky, and had the look of pure hatred in his eye as he clutched the back of his knee, and by his side, a huge machete. I was the last one to get in the car, and before I fully closed the door, we floored it out of there. The girls were bawling their eyes out. We drove until the first house, where we politely knocked and asked for directions to a motel. It was a friendly old couple, and they told us there wasn't one for miles. They took us in and gave us warm food and a place to rest for the remainder of the night. In the morning, the man brought his hunting rifle with us to retrieve our stuff from our campsite. When we got there was nothing stolen, but all our tents were slashed up. The elderly woman called and made a report while we were gone, and when we got back to their home, the officers were there, and we gave them our statements. The officers said there wasn't enough evidence to find the guy, but they promised to search. We headed home later that day. No one said a word on the way home. We were all processing what really happened. The police sadly never found the guy. College split us up a bit, but we barely talk about it as a group since it's been a while. My advice for you all: find yourself a populated place to camp. I don't care if it's some Yogi Bear camp. Be in reach of help and the police. Stay safe, guys. Please. I'm a park ranger. My regular shift consists of handling the entrance booth, cleaning the park and assisting tourists and guests. One summer, one of my supervisors asks me if I'm willing to work overtime for a night shift. Me, being a broke high school student, would do anything to earn a bit of cash. I took the opportunity and was put on the night shift with a few other rangers. A few on patrol and a few near the entrance of the gate. I wasn't given much in terms of tools: a radio, a flashlight, and a notepad. My mobile phone was locked away in my locker as usual, and we weren't allowed to carry any sort of firearm. At 6 p.m. we'd usually close the park by this time, as no more guests were allowed through the main gate. The only exceptions were emergency services. I was stationed in the ranger station until I switched to the booth at 1 a.m. It was boring. You'd usually just sit in a small booth with a 180 dark-tinted windows and expect nothing. You'd hear semi-trucks go by every now and then, and those cicadas in the forest. The fog layers were usually thick. You could hardly see anything. There was barely anything you could do. I was so bored, so I went outside and shined my flashlight around randomly. And, in the glimpse of an eye, the light from my flashlight captured a human-y figure in the pine trees. I thought I was hallucinating because I was so sleepy. I took a brief pause to process what I had just encountered, and looked again, and the figure vanished completely. So I contacted one of the nearby rangers to investigate it, over the dead radio silence. A few minutes passed and the ranger finally arrived to investigate. He walked over and found nothing, no footprints, nothing. I sent out a be on the lookout call to rangers in the park, just in case the person may have run off. They searched the area, but found nothing, and told me I was just seeing things. I knew I wasn't because the figure was so real. I soon accepted that perhaps I was seeing things, and the rest of the night was eerie. The forest was completely silent, which was scary to say the least. It scared me to a point I wouldn't use the toilet for the entire night. Sunrise, and the day shift comes in. Me and the night shift crew head back into the ranger station and end our shift and clock in for the day. I ask one of the rangers which believes in the paranormal, and she mentions that 18 hikers/mountain climbers lost their lives during a 6.0 magnitude earthquake in the park. She told me it was probably one of the deceased, trying to make contact with me. It sent shivers down my spine, and still does when I think about it from time to time. From that night on, I would still take night shifts, but never encountered anything like that again. This story was told to me by my cousin. We were swapping spooky stories at my uncle's cabin when he told me this one. He and two friends decided to take off for the weekend and go camping. They grabbed their gear, food, and camper van and drove out to the mountain range. They checked the forecast beforehand and it said sunny, with no precipitation for the duration of the weekend. It's mid-July. As they're setting up camp, Dave says he's going to eat some magic mushrooms and go for a vision quest. The other two laugh at it and tell him to be careful and not to wander too far. A few hours pass and Dave is yet to return. As it's starting to get dark, he emerges from the bushes with a puzzled look on his face. He explained that the trip was going fine, until he turned around and realized that he'd lost track of the path. He stumbled around the forest for what seemed an eternity, in a thought loop. It wasn't until he stumbled and fell that he realized he was going in the opposite direction of the camp, so he turned around and doubled back. As evening sets in, the crew is getting ready to call it a night, when it starts to snow. Then it starts to really snow, blizzard even. They pack everything in the van and decide to leave the next day. Around 1 or 2 in the morning, Jake, my cousin, wakes up covered in goosebumps. He climbs out of his bed and wanders around the van, first checking to make sure it's locked, and it is. He turns and tries to look out the window, and it's completely frosted over. As he's trying to make anything out at all, a feeling comes over him like there's something bad, or something looking directly back at him from outside. He dismisses it and goes back to bed. The next morning they awake to snow still coming down, Jake still thinking about last night, and walks around to the window as he felt uneasy. To his horror, there are bipedal tracks leading up to the van window, but none leading away. He runs and tells his friends, and they agree to get out of there. They get to the nearest gas station, which is still very remote, and their van breaks down. As they're trying to figure out what to do, this fella drives up to the pump and says, "We haven't seen weather like this for 20 years. You boys be careful out there, something's not right." Then he drives away. Out of nowhere, this large, dark red van pulls up directly in front of them, and the drunk driver says, "Hurry up, get in, I'll take you to the nearest town." With a little hesitation, they get inside. As they drive, he starts going faster and faster until they reach speeds not recommended for winter. Sure that they're gonna perish at this, ghost white and speechless they ride. He gets them to the nearest town, opens the doors and says, "Hurry up, get out." They oblige, and before they can even thank him, he does a U-turn and goes back in the same direction he came in. They later found out the first man they spoke to at the gas station drove a few kilometers and only met his demise via head collision in the storm. It's a crazy world we live in. It's an interesting story. It comes from a very honest person too. He wouldn't exaggerate the details. Let me know what you think. Do you think there was something pulling strings? I'm also intrigued by the guy who drove them out there. Very mysterious. This would have been somewhere near Jasper National Park in Canada. I live in rural Appalachia and adore the wilderness. I often invite friends to come out and camp with me. 1, because I enjoy sharing the wilderness with people close to me, and 2, because there's a creature that lives in my woods. A couple of years ago, maybe 4 or 5, my aunt bought a small cabin from the Amish and placed it there. She intended it to be used as a playhouse for my younger cousin, but my cousin never enjoyed it and could never stay a full night there. The weekend off of school came around, and I called out my friend to see if he'd like to stay in the woods with me for the weekend. He agreed and had his mum bring him out. We started walking and made it not even halfway to our destination when he asked if we could just stay in the new cabin for a night or 2, because the weather said it was going to storm anyway. So we walked back to the top of the hill so that I could text my aunt, and she gave me the okay. It was starting to get dark, so we went ahead and settled down completely in the cabin and started eating what was supposed to be camping rations. We spoke for hours until we looked out the window and noticed it was getting dark and the rain was coming out. We decided it was best to lay down and get to sleep. He passed out almost instantly, leaving me alone in pitch darkness listening to the sound of heavy rain hitting the tin roof. I didn't even realize I fell asleep until I heard a loud knocking and rattling on the door and figured my buddy went out to pee or something. The door had a large window and I could clearly see someone standing there. I was dreading having to crawl out the blankets into the slightly moist, cold air to let him in after he somehow locked himself out. So I rolled over to prepare to stand up, and I was facing his bed, which I couldn't really make out a shape 100% from, but as I forced my eyes I could tell he was still in it. I froze and was in pure terror for what seemed like at least an hour, when I heard the thing at the door make a sound akin to clearing its throat and running into the woods. I waited at least 20 minutes before asking my friend if he was awake, and he immediately said, "Yeah." "Did you see that thing and hear it too?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. "Were you awake when it was whispering?" "No," I replied. We lay there too scared to move or make a sound above a whisper for hours. I would start drifting off and almost immediately would start hearing something tap on the windows, but I would try my best to ignore it, even when I could clearly hear something rubbing its finger on the edge of the tin roof on my side of the cabin. Morning came, and I felt like death. My buddy didn't feel as bad and apparently thought the figure was a dream, but he quickly realized that it couldn't be, the more details that I brought up. We packed up and started to make our way back to my house. Halfway up the hill to my house, I realized the scariest part of everything the night had to offer was that we never locked the door. The rest of the way up my hill was spent with me constantly looking over my shoulder down at the cabin. To this day, I haven't spent another night in it or gave it a glance for longer than 2 seconds on my way to the woods. I live in New York. Recently, I went upstate to the Catskill Mountains with my girlfriend, her younger brother, and their mother. They own land up there, and my girlfriend's father built a cabin. I went there on July 9th and got back to the city on July 12th. We spent 3 nights in the mountain. During the time I was there, nothing unusual happened at all, until the last night. We swam in a lake nearby. Funnily enough, it was called Crystal Lake. We also cooked a lot of food, and overall just had a nice time. One night I did vomit after swimming. However, other than that, nothing strange happened at all, until the 3rd night. To give some backstory, the cabin is great. Has bedrooms and all that, a kitchen, even a ping pong table. However, it doesn't have a shower nor bathroom. You pee in the woods and poop in a bucket, and shower with the outdoor shower they have. The outdoor shower is pretty much a shower head on a huge metal container. You can adjust the temperature with a dial. It has wooden walls surrounding it for privacy. However, the side on the left is completely open to the forest. You stand on a wet rock and shower. This was my first time showering outdoors ever, and I really enjoyed it. At times I would just stand under the water and look out onto the forest. Every time I showered it was dark, after 10 p.m. The only light I had was a lantern and my iPhone flashlight. However, there was no real need for it, since the lantern was pretty strong. On the 3rd night, knowing it would be my last time showering outdoors for a while, I decided to shower pretty late. My girlfriend was asleep and so were her brother and mum. It was around 2 because I checked my phone before going in. I walked to the shower, trying to open the door quietly so that I didn't wake anyone. Eventually, I got there and began showering, and realized midway that I forgot to bring my shampoo. So I decided I would just do what I always did and just stare out into the forest. It was beautiful, and even though it was dark, the lantern lit up most of my surroundings. After 15 minutes of just idly staring into the forest, I started to become uncomfortable. Not because of the water temperature or anything, just physically uncomfortable. I felt like how I felt when I shut the hallway light and ran upstairs into the pitch dark. This hadn't happened to me at all. All the showers I took, I never once felt this way. I tried ignoring it, but eventually it became too much. As I went to turn off the shower, the feeling completely went away. I decided I'd stay in the shower. When I looked back at the forest, I noticed a patch of moss on the tree closest to me, which was odd because it was the tree nearest to me. Even though it was the closest tree, I still couldn't see it properly because I couldn't get the lantern wet. It stays at the entrance of the shower stall area, so the tree is pretty much in the dark. I focused more on the tree until my eyes got irritated from the water constantly hitting them. I rubbed my eyes, and just as I lowered my hands from my face did I see a tall figure walk away in front of the tree. The figure was dark like a shadow, except it had the moss from the tree all over it. No facial features or anything, probably because it was in the pitch dark. When this happened, I walked backwards and turned around to get my clothes and run away. When I turned around, I slipped on a patch of grass and hit my back against the rock I showered on. I felt lightheaded, but fine. I got up, gathered my stuff, and sped-walked back to the cabin. The next morning as we were packing to leave, I hadn't told anyone about what I'd seen or experienced. My back didn't have any bruises nor scrapes or anything, so I thought it was all a dream, until my girlfriend told me that I woke her up a bit when I got back into bed last night. I still didn't tell anyone what I saw. Before we left, I told my girlfriend I left a sock near the shower area and told her I must have dropped it on the way back and that I needed to fetch it. I went to the shower and looked at the tree. There was no moss on it. It was completely gone. All brown, not even a speck of green, just some grey parts on it. I literally said out loud, "Wow," as I stared at it. And that's it. Nothing crazy. Life happens. No weird experiences or encounters. Just plain old normal life. I do wonder what it could have been. Earlier in the year, I went on a long road trip across the states, mainly visiting the national parks and a few cities along the way. Towards the end of the trip, we found ourselves staying in the small town of West Yellowstone. This appeared to be an ideal base while we explored Yellowstone National Park. We booked into a pretty creepy but cheap motel just off the main street for a couple of nights. Me and my fiancé had one room, and my parents another. On the first morning there, we planned to get up early, catch the sunrise and hopefully spot some of the local wildlife. So our alarms were set for 5 a.m. At about 4:45 I was woken by a loud banging on the door, followed by crying and shouting. I instantly jumped out of bed, thinking the worst had happened. I opened the door to my mum in a state of panic, saying that there's someone screaming. A woman is screaming. There, clear as day, I could hear the woman screaming. It sounded as though it was within 100 feet of us, and Mum claimed that it had been happening for the last half hour. We wanted to call the police, but had no phone signal. No phones in the rooms, and we were the only people about. After listening for another 10 minutes or so, we realized we never once heard any form of words come from this scream. No help or get off, just loud, odd old screams. Now, thinking this could be just some local fox or something, we all hit YouTube and Google trying to find a sound clip of the same thing, but no luck. Then, after I'd been hearing the scream for about a half hour, a police officer seemed to appear out of nowhere. He started asking questions about what we were doing and why we were up, and we thought he'd come about the scream, and we quickly told him everything. He then heard the scream and sped off townwards. This scream got less frequent and eventually stopped, so we decided to go about our day. We saw the lovely sights of Yellowstone and even showed several park rangers the video to see if it's an animal. But they all said they had not heard anything like it before. So when we got back to town that evening, we stopped into the sheriff's office to try and get some info. This was met with a lot of hostility from both the reception lady, who eventually closed the shutter in our face, and the same officer we'd seen in the morning. They both said exactly the same thing, almost scripted. "Sorry, ma'am, but that was an intoxicated woman yelling for her boyfriend." I didn't quite understand how they could put it down to someone shouting to their boyfriend. I get it, people get really wasted, but not to a point where you can't even say words. Later that night I did further research, which leads me to loads of different things, but ultimately brought me to the Native American skinwalkers. One thing in particular that struck me was there is a lot of accounts stating that skinwalkers will pretend to be injured humans or even babies to lure in new prey. After really listening to the screams, it almost sounds human in places, but at the same time perhaps sounds like a wild lion. What the hell could this have been? Midsummer's Eve about 10 years ago. Me and my ex-significant other were planning on spending a romantic weekend at his mother's childhood home, which was now serving as a summer cottage. The cottage was located on a tiny island, and in order to reach it you had to first leave your car by the road. It was really remote, so this could be done. Then walk about 2 kilometers through the woods and finally row a boat across a small river. When we reached the cabin, we found the key to the front door was missing. I was already feeling like there was something out of place, but decided I was probably just a bit tired from the journey. My then significant other was really skinny and long, so he managed to wiggle his way through a window and find the door from inside. We then proceeded to unpack our stuff and got a fire going to warm up the sauna, a must on midsummer around here. My ex told me we were going to sleep in the first room on the left, the old master bedroom, and I went in to make the bed ready for us. As I entered, I was at once hit by a strong feeling of dread. We were not welcome there. I tried to shake it off because I didn't want it to ruin our weekend, so I said nothing about it to my ex. We decided to have a bite to eat before going to the sauna, and as we were eating I noticed my ex started to look a bit pale. When I asked him if he was doing okay, he told me he was feeling really ill all of a sudden, and there was a sudden chill that was going through him constantly. I put my hand on his forehead. He was clearly running a high fever. He was feeling fine just before, so we were both a bit puzzled by his sudden unwellness. We thought it would be best for him to rest for a while, so we went into the bedroom to lie down. I wasn't thrilled about going in there, but it was the only place with a bed at the time, so we really had no choice. I remember very vividly what happened next. We were lying on the bed, my ex with his eyes closed and breathing heavily, sickly warmth pouring from him like crazy, and me very much awake and alert. It began as a cold feeling of dread, just like before, but this time it kept escalating to the point of pure fear. My heart was pounding faster and faster as I realized we were in the middle of nowhere. We had no phone, and my ex was the only one who could even drive. Then I saw it in the doorway. A shadowy figure, clearly male, was standing on the doorstep. It was leaning towards us, radiating hate. It seemed reluctant to step all the way in, but made sure I knew if it chose to do so. There was no other way out of the room except through the window, but that was sealed shut. I mustered all my strength, shook my ex by the shoulder and explained to him that we had to leave now. He was still very weak, but I managed to get him up and packing. The figure was nowhere to be seen. It had vanished when I focused on getting my ex to his feet. So we packed up in a hurry and left. I told my ex I had felt and seen something strange, But mainly I explained our haste with the fact that he was ill, and we needed to get back to civilization while he was still able to travel. But what do you know? By the time we had left and crossed the river, he was feeling a lot better, and his fever was all but gone. We reached the car, and he mentioned something about maybe going back now because he was feeling okay, but I quickly refused. We drove back to his parents' house, where there was a small midsummer family gathering taking place. People asked why we returned so soon, but I didn't say anything to anyone about what had happened, only that we came back because he was feeling ill. We had a few drinks, chatted with his relatives, and everything seemed to be going back to normal. So much so that I started to doubt myself. Had I really even seen something? I must have been overreacting, imagining things. Then my ex's uncle speaks up. By the way, did you know that the old place is haunted? I felt my stomach curling up with fear as if I'd swallowed an ice cube stone. Yeah, it really is. I remember my dad telling me about it. He said that even before he was born there were strange things happening down there all the time, according to his own father. Then one day a weird old man appeared at the door and said he was there to help, and proceeded to draw lines across the yard with some kind of metal wire while chanting silently to himself. When the guy was finished, he said he had reconducted the energy flow around the house so that the house would from now on be left untouched by evil, then went on his way. I remember all this when my brother said he had done some landscaping at the cottage and removed a bunch of old wire that was running on the ground. I wonder if the ghost is back now. I heard he really likes to frequent the master bedroom. Isn't that where you guys were sleeping? He laughed heartily at his last comment. I just sat there feeling sick to my core. I didn't dare to ask more details about this claimed entity, why it was thought to be there, or what it had previously done to make itself known. But couldn't stop wondering what would have happened had we not left. This happened to my roommate and I 2 years ago, when we drove into the national forest just outside of the town we live in. We go to this small college in New England about 3 hours from any major city. For context, this forest has quite a few urban legends surrounding it, and the local community, although they do go there often, have a lot of superstition about how to be safe while there. I had just broken up with my partner, and my roommate could sense I was feeling down. Finals were just around the corner, so she decided to help me get my mind off things and suggested we go to a nice spot she found last week and just chill and de-stress. We took a couple of beers with us and drove up to this secluded spot in the forest. From the moment we left the main asphalt road in the forest, I saw a couple of things that unsettled me. You could see the abandoned houses of a ghost town from the higher ground the road was on, and we saw this old doll hanging from a rope on a tree. Creepy stuff. We didn't give it a second thought and just kept on driving. We got to a clearing and parked our cars behind some trees, popped open the back of our SUV, and started just talking and playing music. About 10 minutes later, 2 cars appeared from the road and parked in the clearing. My friend didn't pay them any attention. Instead, she kept talking, but as I was facing them from where I was sat, I couldn't stop seeing what they did. A guy popped out of each car, talked for a few minutes, and then I saw them take out a long object covered in a dark plastic bag from the back of one of their cars. This is when I noticed that these guys were armed, and not like shotguns, which I see often in this town, but handguns, and they started lighting the bag on fire. I told my friend to get down. She turned around and saw them for the first time. Black smoke was rising from the bag, and between trying to keep my head down and steal glances at them, I saw one of them take out a second object, and I heard them shoot it right before they set it on fire. I don't know how long my friend and I were lying there in silence, but it was definitely enough to let the terror sink in and whisper to each other how much we loved each other in case this was what we thought it was. At some point I looked up and saw they were pointing at our car and saw them walking into the woods, maybe trying to follow our tracks or trying to look for us. All I know is that right then and there I told my friend to jump into the driver's seat and make a run for it. I shut the back door, and between that and the car starting up, the guys heard it and started running towards us, then ran towards one of their cars and hopped in. We went over a hill and driving way above what was safe for dirt roads on a hillside, but we managed to lose them. We drove to a neighboring town and roamed around for a while, just to make sure no one was following us before we went back to our dorm. That day we tried to make fun of the whole situation and got really drunk, before finally breaking down and crying from knowing we had seen something we weren't supposed to. We were at first terrified of telling anyone, but eventually did tell officers on campus who contacted the police. But they never found anything. My wife and I were camping last night in Blue River Reservoir in Oregon. We camp here often and decided to explore up FSR 520 and found a cool abandoned bridge far back in the woods over Cook Creek. The spot was beautiful and we were set up over the river on this long abandoned bridge over the creek. If you've ever been up to Oregon woods, you know that they can give off a creepy vibe, and this was no exception. But it really was a dream campsite, being 40 feet directly over a river while on a bridge with limbs growing everywhere over it isn't your everyday spot. I'll throw in the background that there was no one within at least 3 miles of us, and we had to hike a little from our car, approximately 1/10 of a mile. We explored around the area for quite a bit and didn't come across anything out of the ordinary besides a pair of shoes and a name Mona written in ash on a rock of a firing. While we were sitting by the fire, I noticed a very bright flash of light over the river and snapped my head up but didn't see anything. A few moments later, I was paying closer attention and watched a ball of light float, even with the bridge 40 feet in the air, from one side to the other of the woods over 50 feet. The light was very blue. My first thought is that I should have heard a car if it were headlights. But how could a car or the lights arrive to such an isolated area? The blue light was unlike anything I'd ever seen. I mentioned it to my wife but didn't want to freak her out, so dropped the subject soon after. Later that night in the tent, we had the mesh lining up where we could see outside. My wife gasped and watched as the same blue light floated at the other end of the bridge, 30 feet away, and hovered in the air. After a good bit of time, it shot into the woods. It being late at night, we were obviously scared of someone's headlamp, but it shot 40 times quicker away than any human could go, and we saw nothing attached. Our dog left the tent and stared at that spot for the next 10 minutes, while also peeking down the side of the bridge very seriously. Has anyone had a similar experience on Forest Development Road 520 in Blue River Reservoir, Oregon? I'd love to hear it. My mum's side of the family used to have a small cabin in the woods, in the Pocono Mountains, surrounded by trees. But it wasn't like a fancy cabin with a hot tub, more like a very small hunting cabin built by my late grandfather and my uncles. It had a small porch with a picnic bench, a gravel lot to park, and then maybe 15 feet away a nice-sized fire pit with a bench and a few logs around it. The driveway was a very long drive up the side of the mountain, off a very secluded highway. The house was small, but the land they owned was pretty big. We had a neighbor, but he was maybe half a mile away, maybe a bit closer. We couldn't see them through the woods and rarely heard them except for maybe some gunshots during hunting season. You could hear the occasional car on the highway, but otherwise, the house was kind of in the middle of nowhere. We used to always spend time up there when we were younger, with all our cousins. However, just me and my family would go up there every once in a while in the summer. We would go hiking and visit the local amusement park and have big bonfires and roast marshmallows and cook burgers. At night, we would walk further down the drive towards the highway, where the trees weren't as close together so that we could see the stars. Without all the light pollution, you could seriously see everything. It was a great time. Anyway, One summer, I was 13. Our family of 5 took a trip up there. My family being me, my 2 older sisters, my mum and dad. And I used to be, and still am, afraid of the dark, and especially the woods. So especially the woods in the dark. So I would really only go outside if one of my siblings or a parent were with me, which they usually were. One night, we lit the bonfire and were talking and roasting marshmallows and enjoying the summer night. I was pretty tired from whatever we had done earlier that day, so I decided to join my mum inside on the couch. I ended up falling asleep in the living room. I woke up a few hours later. Upset, I fell asleep and missed the rest of the fire. I pulled aside the curtains to check if anyone was still outside, and from the window I could see the fire pit clearly still ablaze, and what I assumed was my dad sitting on the bench by himself. Not wanting my dad to be alone, I opted to join him. Now, since I hate the dark, and even though the pit wasn't terribly far, that walk still felt long in the pitch dark. I don't know what possessed me to go outside without looking for any other member of my family, or even check the time. So I opened the door and stepped onto the porch and called my dad to ask him why he was still there. The pit was maybe 15 to 20 feet away, but he should have heard me in the night. I clearly see the fire pit and can clearly see my dad, even though he was sitting on the bench on the opposite side of the fire. Confused, I start to walk down the steps, and then slowly towards the fire pit, asking him why he wasn't responding. As I get closer, I keep calling him, when I realize that while I should be hearing the roar of the fire, there is absolute and complete raging silence. And then I notice that there is no one sitting by the bench anymore. At this point, I am only feet away from the fireman bench. My blood immediately turned ice cold. I whipped around and sprinted back up the house, not daring to stop or look behind me. I locked the door, ran into my dad's bedroom only to find him there under his blankets asleep. I didn't want him to wake up, to let him know how stupid I was, so I just crawled under the covers beside him and prayed to fall asleep. The next morning I told my parents what happened. My mum keeps telling me it was just a dream, but I woke up from a dream on the couch right before, and then went outside and this all happened. I used to have the same recurring dream every time I went to the cabin, and I would only have that dream when I was in the cabin. I specifically remember having this very same dream again, and then waking up on the couch. This same creepy dream is the same reason I always slept next to my dad anytime we stayed at the mountains. I never felt safe sleeping alone. That meant my mum would share a bed with my eldest sister. They both snored, so it was fine. My dad tells me it wasn't possible. One, because he always deadbolts the door before he goes to sleep. And there was no way I would have been able to push the deadbolt open without him waking up. And 2, because he always puts the fire out before bed as well, which is basic fire safety. All I know is what I saw, and that it wasn't a dream. This is a story that my aunt told me. My family is from the Caribbean. This happened to her as a child, nearly 50 years ago. So my Aunt Jane lived in a small village surrounded by forests, sugarcane fields and rice paddy. One day, Jane and her cousins decided to play a game. Jane and her cousins knew this forest extremely well, since they played there every day. After a while, they noticed their cousin Jack was missing. They searched everywhere for Jack and called out to him, yet he was nowhere to be found. After an hour of searching, they decided to send one of their cousins to run and get help. Jane's uncle arrived a little while after and began helping the search for Jack. Another hour passed and the uncle came upon a thick growth of thorny vines and bushes. He heard shouting coming from nearby, but there were so many thorns and vines, it was so thick, he had to use his cutlass to go through it. And there was no way a child could go through it, that's how thick it was. When he finally cleared a path, he entered a small, clear patch, and Jack was sitting in the very center. He asked Jack how he got there, and he had no memory of what happened after they began playing the game. He had no scratches on him, and his clothes were clean with no dirt on them. There is no way he could have gotten in there. My aunt says my family thought it might have been a Derwent, which in folklore in these parts are fairy-like creatures that have feet that face backwards and try to lure people into the forest. My husband and I have been together 9 years, and this happened on our first real date. I want to start off by saying I am an absolute skeptic, to the point where I've always secretly scoffed about paranormal activities. Yet, I can't explain this. I met my husband in a little dive bar he was managing. We clicked instantly, and he's a very outdoorsy guy, so we hooked up a couple of times, then he officially asked me out on an overnight hike. I had a 10-month-old St. Bernard pup who of course came with. We drove up way past Cougar towards Mount St. Helens and parked on the trailhead leading to Bolt Camp. It's just a little shelter along the Lewis River, about 5 to 6 miles in. So we packed all our gear and even a backpack for my dog and headed out. I can't stress how beautiful that hike is. Massive Doug firs covered with moss. Sometimes there were little wooden bridges crossing streams along the trail. My husband would always yell, "Watch out for trolls," when we crossed them. We got kind of a late start, so the sun went down and it was almost fully dark by the time we arrived. There were so many hollow stumps, the setting sun would shine through them, and they lit up inside. They looked like little hobbit houses with fires burning through the hearths. And the mushrooms, my God, they were bioluminescent ones that glowed green in the dark. It took forever, and he kept saying it was around the next bend, but it never was. We finally arrived and unpacked. It was awesome. You can Google Bolt Camp. It's a wooded, 3-sided shelter. You'll even see my saint in one of those pics. People leave stuff at Bolt Camp for the next folks. Someone had left a half bottle of scotch. We partook in that when we left, and we hung a little baggie of weed from the rafters and some beer and water. Anyway, we made a fire and cooked steak on rocks, got drunk and fell in love. I fell asleep first and slept towards the inside of the shelter. My now husband and dog towards the outside. It was late in October and quite dry. It was very, very cold and the fire wouldn't stay lit. Eventually he fell asleep too. My St. Leo kept growling in the dark, and they bonded over that. "What do you see, buddy? What's out there?" They were both awake when I awoke. Thinking it was 2 to 3 a.m., I was facing the back wall of the shelter, and then I saw it. A wispy, gossamer, cobweb-looking thing floating to and fro in the back of the shelter. It would flip and spin and turn over itself. It was so beautiful and fascinating. I wasn't scared. I was really thinking I wanted to wake him up, but I barely knew the dude and was afraid he would think I was nuts. So I watched it until I fell asleep. Morning came and I never mentioned it. We fed the dog, ate a bunch of trail mix and cheese and sausage and hiked back, and I dropped him off at his place. Like I said, we fell in love that night and moved in together some months later. We were reminiscing about our awesome hike when he decided to share something with me. I dropped him off that day at his house, and that same evening he was out on his porch having a smoke when he saw something. A cobwebby thing turning over and over on itself, floating back and forth in the street lamps. He found this interesting. He watched it and finally it settled on a clump of bushes. He went to take a closer look and a pair of glowing red eyes materialized, and he decided he wanted no part in it and ran away. This is a man afraid of nothing. Anyway, I obviously immediately told him about what I had seen and how I was too embarrassed to share. The similarities are too great. It had to be the same thing. Also, I've searched and searched and can't find any legends that match up with the description of the thing we saw. If anyone has any idea of what it could be, please advise. Back in September of 2013, I went to North Carolina with my husband, sister-in-law, mother-in-law and her fiancé, soon-to-be father-in-law, to attend my mother-in-law's wedding. We stayed in a very cute little cottage in the Smoky Mountains in Franklin, in a cute small neighborhood with decently spaced out houses swerving up a hill on the bottom side of a mountain. We spent a lot of time in Cherokee, at the reservation as well, which was relatively close if I remember correctly, but all of this happened back in Franklin. One evening we were all sat outside the front porch of the cabin decorating wine glasses with paint, while my father-in-law played the guitar. We noted how silent everything in the neighborhood was. No crickets, no birds, no wind. A little later, my sister-in-law and mother-in-law went to bed early, and my father-in-law and husband were on the couch in the living room watching TV. I decided to go into the kitchen and make macaroni and cheese. The living room was right next to the kitchen entrance, and the couch my husband was on was the closest to the light switch to the kitchen. While I was draining the noodles, the light suddenly turned off on me. I yelled, "Hey!" and turned around and saw my father-in-law sleeping. I walked into the living room to see my husband sleeping as well. I said his name to wake him up and asked him why he turned the light off on me, thinking he was pulling a prank. He woke up and was visibly drowsy and said he didn't. I told him what happened, and my father-in-law woke up and heard what happened. Both my mother-in-law and sister-in-law were in their bedrooms still sleeping, and there's no way that they made it past me that fast and turned around as soon as the light went off, as I had a clear view of the living room entrance to the ground floor bedrooms, and the start of the stairs that lead to the upstairs bedroom. My father-in-law and husband came into the kitchen to investigate. We all looked at the light switch, which was in the off position, and my father tried messing with it to see if he could get it stuck in between on and off, to see if maybe that could have been the option. He couldn't get it to work. My husband told me to stop talking about it as they were both getting creeped out, and they both resumed watching TV. Even later that night, while I was sleeping with my husband and sister-in-law in the upstairs bedroom with the AC on, blaring on full blast, I woke up to a blood-curdling scream. I sat up and listened to it for a while and was surprised at just how loud it was, since I could hear it over the AC. I was pretty sure it was coming from outside, and I had to pee badly, so I slowly crept downstairs to the bathroom. I was able to hear the scream much more clearly from there. It was so horrifying I stood there in the bathroom in fear, and after I was done, shaking a little in fear, I realized it sounded like a woman in pure agony. It started out high and by the end got really low, and sounded like at the end of each scream she had to put up with something being ripped from her abdomen, as if each scream physically hurt. About an hour later, it was still going on, and it was only at that point where I gained the courage to go upstairs again. I tried waking my husband, but he's a very deep sleeper, and I had a hard time getting his attention. I knew if I'd have managed to wake him up, he would give me attitude and tell me half asleep he doesn't hear anything over the AC, and to just go back to bed. His sister is a lot like him when it comes to sleep, and she was still knocked out on the bed across the room. I gave up and tried to sleep it off. The bedroom we were in was in the attic. It had a door leading outside with a stairway leading down to the yard. When I was trying desperately to fall back asleep, I couldn't help but imagine a tall, skinny, lean, muscly being with very long limbs standing on the other side of the door. The image haunted me for quite a while, but I somehow managed to fall back to sleep. I don't think that I was necessarily seeing what the thing looked like. I'm just trying to express the amount of fear this thing gave me. I became far too afraid to wake anyone up to investigate whatever it was. I considered someone might be in danger, but it sounded too unreal, almost like it was something pretending to be human. For the past 6 years that happened, I've been trying to figure out what it was that I heard. I looked up YouTube videos of different animals screaming. Foxes, deer, mountain lions, you name it. Nothing was quite like what I heard. The closest thing was a mountain lion, but it would have had to have been a pretty large one on steroids, being an axe murderer or something. If anyone else has had a similar experience or is able to point me to a video with what they think it sounds like, I would appreciate it. There was a really creepy wooden figure of a duck in the living room of the cottage, but all its legs were painted red, and the red paint dripped down its unpainted legs, and its head was on backwards. It had a name tag on it that said, "My name is Melissa," and we all joked that it was trying to scare us. This all started 2 years ago, in the beginning of October 2018. My dad and I went camping in southern Ohio. I was 34 and my dad was 58 at the time. We went over to my grandma's house because she has a lot of secluded woods and basically lives in the middle of nowhere. The area has had a history of religious practices by the Hopewell Indians and occultism by certain groups who go into the woods on certain dates and perform ceremonies, but I thought nothing of it. These ceremonies have been witnessed by my cousin while hunting and by my grandparents for years now. I parked my car and my dad and I began carrying all the camping equipment to the deep woods. We ended up walking 3 to 4 miles back and finally found a spot to settle in and pitch the tent. After an hour or so, we decided to move from that spot to the top of the fairly large hill to have a better view, and I feared it might rain and didn't bring the top to cover my tent properly to keep the rain out. As we walked to the top, we ended up running into an 1800s style cabin, standing, but had no doors, no windows, but the roof was intact, and it did have all 4 walls and a roof. I have seen this cabin many times, as it is along a trail through the woods near my grandma's property, and this was the worst mistake we could have ever made during this trip. I had all my camping gear and food lined up on some old wooden benches, in which the cabin had 2 benches in total. It was around 7:30 when we set up our tent and other things. We could hear cars echoing off the hills when they would drive by, and we were about 3 to 4 miles to the nearest exit of the woods, and there was no one around in any direction, and there are a few people who live out in this part of Ohio. After an hour to hour and a half of being out there, at around 8:30 to 9, I start to hear these faint whispers in the corner of the cabin which caught me off guard, and I was a little disturbed to say the least. I asked my dad if he hears the whispering as well, and he says, yes. As I'm sitting there trying to figure out where these sounds are coming from exactly, looking in the direction I hear them, I see nothing. We had a few flashlights with us as well, and I could see nothing. They eventually stopped after 15 to 20 minutes. As Dad and I were laying there, all of a sudden, a large cat walked into our space from the outside and sat right next to our tent. I can hear this large cat because it began purring with a very deep tone, as mountain lions would stand about a foot from us. I'm lying petrified in my tent, as well as my dad, who's just listening to this cat, and as it walked to us, it hit the top of my head, as I'm tall, 6'2", and the tent wasn't quite big enough. To remind you, I'm an avid outdoorsman and hunt and have fished. I've never experienced something like this camping in Ohio. I've camped all over the US and have lived in places including Minnesota, North Dakota, Idaho, but originally from Ohio. I also have no weapons with me because in Ohio I never had an issue. As we lay there, I began to sit up with my flashlight to see this cat, but I see nothing and it continues to purr deeply. I saw a shadow outside, as we had light in the top middle of our tent, so it should have cast a shadow when it walked nearby. I know for a fact it wasn't a bobcat, which Ohio has. Its purring was much too powerful, sounding to be a cat log that size. As I'm sitting up in the tent, the cat begins pummeling my food and bottles of Mountain Dew that I'd put on the benches, and then shortly after sounded like it jumped from one of the windows. I sat there in amazement over this and could not understand what just happened. To my surprise, it only got much worse. Not long after the cat left, we then began to hear leaves ruffling and a bipedal creature over and over again throughout the night with large limbs and trees breaking and small rocks being thrown out the cut-out windows. I got my flashlight and shined it towards the ruffling of the leaves, but the strange thing was you could not see a physical creature in the direction of the sound, nor the limbs breaking. These same patterns of leaves and branches breaking continued over and over again. I went back to my tent dumbfounded, and soon after my dad and I heard 2- and 4-legged creatures start to run around the cabin, making all kind of ungodly sounds, lasting at least 5 to 10 minutes. Then out of nowhere, one of these creatures starts beating on the side of the cabin, hitting it twice with a thundering noise. My hair started to stand on end. I was in utter shock, along with my dad. These same patterns of sounds lasted 8 hours, before we eventually packed a few things and decided to run for it. Before we left, the beating of the cabin grew louder with each hit. The last hit of the cabin before we decided to leave was around 4 a.m. It was so loud I thought I was going to be deaf from it. I can only describe this sound as a large 12-gauge shotgun, 3.5-inch buckshot loaded in it, and shot in a close proximity to hear the sound. As we got up to leave, we had our flashlights on, standing back to back, walking out, and everything went silent all around us. As we got so far on the trail, we began running along until we reached a valley in the woods, and we stopped, because just to the right of us stood this creature. It was so dark in the woods, even with a flashlight, but you could see this creature standing on a small hill, looking down on us with yellow eyes set pretty far apart from each other, and it appeared from our distance to be at least 7 foot tall. If I had to guess, the outline was massive, you see. It seemed like this thing was absorbing the light shined on it. It literally just stood there, never moving, never wavering while we stared. We decided to keep running until we got out the woods and off the trail, which still had 2 to 3 miles to go. We made it out the woods without further encounters or incidences, but it didn't end there. As we got to the road, we started walking towards my grandma, where we were parked with my SUV, and right in front of us was a bridge that's very small in size where a creek runs through. As we got off the bridge, in the distance we saw the same yellow eyes and shined my flashlight on it, but it took off running into the side of small woods. Soon after it ran into the woods, we heard an owl hooting a few times, and right after the hooting sound, we heard a loud deep groan call out, and then the groan changed into a few very deep mumbling sounds, almost like it was trying to talk or make words, but it sounded like a bunch of nonsensical words. I again stood there in shock. Never in my life have I ever heard that sound. And the craziest thing was literally it sounded like it was 15 to 20 feet away when it occurred. We ran the rest of the way to my grandma's house, waking her up and telling her what happened. I then got my keys and left. Nothing else occurred as we drove out that place. I grew up in this area, and the only time I heard of something happening was when I was 10. So, me and both my uncles ran down the house shaking from head to toe. They explained that they were hunting late, and it got really dark on them, and they were beginning to walk. As they were walking, they saw a creature or animal begin to growl and chase them, but they couldn't see it. They were back to back shooting shotguns in the direction of this creature, which did nothing to scare it away, and it chased them all the way, and never once did they look back to see what it was. After my night from hell, I felt like I was in the Twilight Zone and would never return to camp in that area again. It has bothered me to this day, wondering what in the world took place, and what in the world were those creatures from hell. My parents forced me into a church camping. It wasn't from any church, and I didn't want to be friends with the people there. My female cousin went too, so we had a nice conversation. The place was okay, but around it had a lake and a bridge to the forest to the other side of the lake. There was this weird air in the area around the camping place where we were at. I remember exploring it, and there was a very bad energy there. Ripped clothes, campfires that looked old, black trash bags hanging in the trees, all that in the forest around the camping area. At one of the last 3 nights there, they finally lit a campfire for us to be around. Me and my cousins were talking for a moment, and then we remained quiet for 5 minutes. I looked away into the forest, and there was a little lake splitting us from there. Suddenly I saw a man running around the lake in the forest area. He was wearing a white, huge, Jesus kind of cloth and using no shoes. He ran very fast and I watched him and felt very scared. I looked at my cousin and then she looked at me spooked. I asked her if she saw something and she described exactly what I saw. We got that creepy feeling from it and nobody from the church believed us. Even to this day I can remember the man, who was tall in white robes and very pale, running on bare feet, giving off this awful vibe. Growing up, I had a neighbor who spent as much time with me as my own family. He also had a son a few years younger than myself, and we were all friends. They lived across the road from us. Behind their house was a heavily wooded ridge with an overgrown road going partially up it. At the end of this road was an old mobile home trailer from the 60s or 70s. It was captured by my neighbor's father, who was a state trooper during a drug raid, and was used as a hunting cabin for many years. At the time of this story, it was in a horrible state of repair, and by no means was probably safe to be in. My neighbor was utilizing it to store random stuff. So one night, I was over at their house as usual, and myself plus my neighbor's son was starting to get bored. At this point it was around 2 a.m. We decided to take the walk up to the trailer and sit there for a bit. So we gathered a flashlight and a small lantern, then headed up. At first things were uneventful. There was a light mist and rain, and it was a bit chilly but not that bad. We sat in the trailer amidst stored items in the decay of the place with the lantern for about 20 minutes, just hanging out and talking. We were discussing leaving when we heard footsteps outside. I have grown up in the woods, and the cadence or rhythm of steps people tend to make compared to animals is noticeable. These were human and heavy. We had heard nothing come up, nor had we seen anything on our way up. At this point, it made its way to the door of the trailer and stopped outside. We called and asked who was there, but there was nothing. No steps, no rustling, nothing. I, at least, had no inclination to be trapped there by anyone or anything, and picked up a rather heavy metal rod that happened to be there, and we whispered a plan. After a second, I kicked the door open with enough force to slam it against the trailer and almost shut it again while my friend shone the light out. There was nothing there. No sounds of running, nothing at all. We gathered all our courage, hopped out and looked around for a minute. Still nothing to see nor hear. No footprints, no anything. We decided it was best at this point to take our asses back to the house, to which we did. We still didn't see or hear anything on the way back. And I don't know for sure what it was that we saw that night exactly. When I was about 7 or 8, we used to live in Webster, Wisconsin, and we lived in a house a little bit wider and longer than a trailer house. No upstairs, just the base floor and basement. It was a beautiful house with a big area that was just woods. One day my cousin was supposed to be watching my 2 sisters and I, and he said we could all go play outside as long as we stayed within his sight. But within 5 minutes, he ran into the woods and told us to keep up. Of course, we listened to him and ran after him, but soon he disappeared, and we couldn't see him nor the house, nor the tree line where the wood stopped. We were well and truly lost and started freaking out and crying. And then about a half hour later, a really tall Native American chief came up behind us and asked us what was wrong and why we were crying and if we're okay and lost. I told him how we were chasing my cousin and we lost him, and we didn't know how to make it back home. He smiled and said, "Don't worry, sweetheart. Just come to my village, rest for a little bit, eat some lunch, play with the children, and when you're ready you can explain to me where you live." I said okay, and we go back to his village. It's a smaller one in the middle of the woods in a clearing, but it had at least 60 people. We ate stew, and they had me draw in the dirt, the road, and our house. He smiled and said, "I know exactly where you live. If you want to play for a little bit, that's okay, but I want to get you home before dark. There are a lot of dangers in these woods like bears, coyotes, bobcats, and that's not good for children to be out in." So he took us home, and he didn't leave the edge of the woods. My mom came out crying, asking where we were, saying she was about to call the cops. We had been missing for 4 to 5 hours. She asked us why we left the house without Scotty, my cousin, and I said he ran with us into the woods and we followed him, but then he disappeared. He then came outside and said he had never left the house. He thought we were in our rooms. So I told my mum what happened and she said we'll figure it out tomorrow. The next day we went and followed our footprints and found the village. Or what used to be the village. There was almost nothing there. What had been a gorgeous place was now ash. It had all been burned down to the grass, which was shorter the day before than it stood today. It was taller than me, and it looked like it was burned down and left vacant for hundreds of years. We called out to them with no response. We found the chief's headdress and a doll made of deer hide and some other kind of cloth as we were about to head back. And then I found a huge eagle feather the size of my arm. And that was the most amazing and spooky encounter I've ever had. My family and I were camping at Bucks Lake in California last summer. Our campsite was located right near the water. Other campsites were about 100 feet away, and a bathroom within walking distance down the narrow road. 2 days into the trip, my son and I were getting ready to take our canoe onto the lake. I sat at camp as my son walked down the small road to the bathrooms. I waited for a while and decided to walk over to the bathrooms. I never saw him come out and thought he walked back in a different direction. On my way back to camp, he was sitting there waiting for me. He looked surprised and asked me why I had walked right by him and didn't say anything. I was shocked and told him I never saw him walk out the bathroom. The campsite is situated where you can see the bathrooms from our narrow parking spot next to our parked cars. I was sitting in a chair facing the bathroom watching him walk in there and waited the whole time, yet he never passed me. However, my son said that when he walked right past me, I was getting out my chair and I actually brushed up against his arm. He looked right at me, but I apparently just ignored him. I told my mum about this right after it happened, and she explained to me how a similar thing happened to him back a few days earlier. He was in his room when she walked in to say hi. When he wasn't there, she walked back to the living room, where he approached her and asked her why she'd come into his room, looked at him, and then just left. I am an East Tennessee native and have grown up going to the Smokies. I have also had a strange or seemingly paranormal experience while in the area. So my grandparents own a bunch of rental properties and cabins in Townsend and surrounding the Smokies for holidays, etc. And my extended family would always gather together at these cabins for the holidays. I'd had little things happen here and there, like feeling watched while playing in the woods growing up with my brothers and cousins, or hearing strange and human-sounding noises outside at night where there weren't any animals or predation, as I'm very aware and educated on the local wildlife of the Smokies, but nothing super substantial or scary enough that I actually experienced true terror or fear, mostly just weird little things here and there. Something's being knocked off a table in the cabin or bumps in the night. Anyway, one Christmas around 2010, me and my twin brother were given a cabin to ourselves for the weekend, within a half-mile or so from the rest of the family cabins, and my grandparents' main cabin. We are both 19 at this point, so not little kids by any means. First night there, we drink and I fell asleep early downstairs on the couch, and he passes out in the upstairs bedroom loft. No big deal. Next night he's asleep on the couch, and I'm upstairs in the loft laying in bed. I begin getting the feeling of being watched. Like, not just the little paranoia feeling. It starts off and it builds up to the point where I'm almost in full-blown panic. Now I'm a 20-year-old male at this point, and keep telling myself that I'm just being a coward, and the gut feelings are ridiculous. But the feeling persists. I'm now wide awake looking around the cabin in the pitch darkness for something. I keep seeing movement from the corner of my eye, and just like that, all of a sudden it becomes completely silent, like the Oz effect or whatever other people have called it. I'm laying there, heart pounding, when I hear something whisper in my ear. When I say whisper, it was in a raspy, drawn-out tone, but was still startling loud, as if someone was leaning over the bed directly above me, saying it into my ear. I jumped up, went downstairs, and fell asleep on the floor beside my brother on the couch, scared like a little kid. We woke up next morning, and my brother was extremely surprised to find me down there with him, but didn't say anything or ask any questions as to why I was curled up beside them on the couch. Within a year later, around Halloween, we were talking with some family and friends about strange experiences, and out of nowhere my brother says to everyone, "Yeah, I definitely think Grandpa's cabins in the Smokies are haunted or something," and goes on to talk about how he had this same weird feeling the night before I slept upstairs in the loft. He's feeling watched, panicked, and all the same feelings as me. He, like myself, couldn't really even verbalize the feeling of being watched by something malicious well. I kinda yell in excitement about having the same gut feeling there, but that's when he realizes the reason the next night why I was asleep on the floor next to him. But afterwards I did confide in him embarrassingly. I might add that to this day I have no idea what happened in those cabins. My grandparents sold them all and we haven't been back. It was strange and weird. My personal opinions is that it's something to do with the energy from the mountains. The energy from the Native Americans who lived there for centuries before us. I believe the entity that spoke to me was purely malicious. When I was around 5, I went camping with my parents in a place called Bear Creek Reservoir in British Columbia. It's a very isolated place deep in the woods. We got there by driving up an old logging road. The actual reservoir itself is very beautiful and quiet. I actually looked up the area on Google Maps, and it still gives me chills even looking at it from a satellite perspective, but anyway. So the day passed without incident. We mostly just swam the whole day and went to bed, but the following morning I woke up in my parents' tent just as the sun was making its appearance. I unzipped the tent and noticed a figure standing maybe 50 feet away. The light was fairly dim, so it was hard to make out distinct details, but it was just standing there staring at me unmoving. The entity had the figure of a woman of average size, but instead of seeing a face there was just darkness. But I could tell it was looking at me. And instead of clothes, the skin it had were leaves and sticks as if it were made from them. I remember feeling very afraid of this creature, like if I had left the tent I wouldn't be seen again. So I tried waking up my parents, but they were both really annoyed I woke them up, and didn't believe me until they finally got up later and explored the area. We ended up finding a bunch of man-made structures made of branches and other weird stuff in the area. I was driving through Kokoniko National Forest last week, on the way to the Grand Canyon with my boyfriend. It was around 12 to 1 a.m., and I was chillaxing playing my Switch while he drove us down through the forest. Suddenly he jumps and yells, "What the?" clearly startled. I asked what was wrong, and he said he saw a lady standing on the side of the road, pointing to the other side. Apparently he thought he saw something up in the road and turned on the high beams illuminating the woman. Without contemplating it too much, I looked at where he said the woman was pointing, and out of the bushes stepped a massive bull elk with a few females behind him, and we had to swerve hard to dodge him in time. Had I been playing my Switch and not seen them, we likely would have smashed right into what might as well have been a brick wall. So then I started to think about it and realized we were deep in a part of the forest where there are no marked campsites and no inhabited dwellings. And while it's not entirely impossible to assume that someone on the road is a camper, the way she apparently just appeared out of nowhere and was deliberately pointing to where the hidden elk were to the only car within a 30-mile radius seemed incredibly strange and even more unlikely. What's interesting is that my boyfriend is super in touch with the paranormal. He's a bit more susceptible to energies and the like. He often feels or sees presences going about their old routines, and apparently has been seeing these things since he was small. And this isn't him doing an attention grabby thing. He didn't tell me about his paranormal sensitivity until we had been dating for a few months, and only after the elk incident. I'm curious if it was specifically a guardian spirit for us, or just a presence that was trying to protect us as we passed. I was 14 years old when I went on this camping trip with my family and best friend. It was nighttime, and my friend and I decided to walk over the park at the campground to swing. We get there and I instantly have this bad feeling, but I ignore it. We start swinging and I can't help but look to the top of the playground. It was like a big jungle gym with a tower at the top. Standing there was this young boy who couldn't have been older than 6. I couldn't make out his face, but it was dark to a shadow, so I knew it wasn't a bad spirit. He was sobbing and begging me to help him. He said his parents didn't love him and that he was practically the black sheep of the family. The last thing he told me was that he wanted to pass, and I needed to leave. It felt so real, I wanted to save him, but I knew that this wasn't an actual boy. So I freaked out and started running back to camp with my friend following. When we got back to the camper, I told everyone what happened, and my friend said she saw and heard nothing. My stepmom's face went white and said that we need to go see my mother now. Well, my mum was on the phone, so she didn't hear what happened. Turns out my mum was on the phone with my aunt, and my aunt was ready to take her own life. She's the black sheep of the family, and my grandma doesn't like her at all. So what I was seeing and hearing was exactly what my aunt was feeling and thinking. We talked and I told her everything I experienced. She knew after that it wasn't her time to go, and that we shared a special bond. Thankfully, she's still around today. Ocala National Forest, Florida. I probably came across either a poacher's camp or a drug operation, and they put signs up to scare people away. Me and my friends were hunting there and stayed out past midnight looking for hogs. We realized we were way deeper in the woods than we planned on being and began to walk out. We were probably 3 or 4 miles into the woods from the main road, heavily armed with AR-15s, sidearms, and a fixed blade hunting knife in a hip sheath. So we really weren't afraid of anything, plus the moon was bright enough to navigate by even under the trees. We had lights mounted on our rifles, and I had a large, powerful flashlight in my hand that I could make into a strobe or use as a club. Whatever. The point is, we were not paranoid about anything. We were heading back and we start to hear something hauling through the woods on our right, and it was about to cross the trail in front of us. Most trails are old logging roads and are pretty wide, and they make square quadrants out the forest. This particular trail cut across one of the quadrants and was overgrown and thin. We thought it was a deer or maybe a black bear. Either way, we couldn't shoot it at night, so instead of using the rifle lights, I used my handheld light, and we waited until we heard it get near the trail. I then turned on my light, and all we saw were a pair of white legs cross the thin trail about 50 feet in front of us. They looked human. We were baffled. Like, what kind of moron goes crashing through the deep woods at 1 a.m. in shorts? And through the thick brush, not the trail. Super weird. But again, we're armed, and we are here for hogs. And we push on because it would have taken us at least 30 minutes to turn back and go around the quadrant. We hear crashing now, and then in the woods, but it never got close to us again. Finally, we reached my car, and I was relieved it was still there and not broken into. We kept the rifles loaded, shoved our handguns between the seats, and sent a console and get in the front seat. I began to drive out the forest with my moonroof open, and the stars were just gorgeous. It's easy to forget how amazing the night is in the middle of Ocala National. About half a mile down the road, my headlights fall onto a man in a checker button-down shirt and shorts just walling along the road. We are miles away from any other paved roads, and then it's another 5 to 10 miles on that paved road to get to town. Also, this is in the northern part of the forest, where there were no old cabins that were built before it was declared a national park. This dude had no backpack, no anything. Was this what we crossed paths with? What was he doing walking out here at basically 2 a.m. with no supplies, no flashlight, no nothing? He didn't even look at us as we passed. As we got near the paved road, we unloaded the rifles and put them in the trunk and went home. It was a really fun trip, and I can't wait to go back, but I'll always be armed in Ocala National. Some seriously weird stuff is going on out there. Context. I was 17 when this happened. I'm female, and spoilers, I'm a lot more savvy now than I used to be. I was 17 and had just started a relationship with a guy who I thought was the world. Turns out he cheated on me several times and was no good for me. My parents warned me off. They told me he was a loser and a bum. You see, he was 27, so a lot older than me, had dropped out of high school and had pretty much been homeless for a long time. He and I met through mutual friends at a party, and we really hit it off, and I thought he was the love of my life. Oh, to be 17. In any case, he told me to run away from home, that my parents didn't understand our love, and that we should be free to do whatever we pleased. It didn't matter that I was still going to school. He convinced me with his sweet words, and off I ran. We were gone for about 3 weeks when this happened. Life had already started to seem quite bleak. Being homeless was nowhere near as glamorous as he made it out. Sleeping rough, having to struggle for food, and he rinsed the little money I had in my bank account relatively quickly. He told me of a cabin that he knew, right near the edge of the woods. He said that he had rented it off the owner before, and that they went way back. I, totally smitten, agreed with the proposal. It would be nice to have a roof over our heads. Truth be told, I was starting to miss my parents, but I was still blindsided by love. He took me to the cabin, which was about a 4-hour walk, and when we finally got there, it was heaven compared to how rough I'd been sleeping. To think I'd finally be able to shower. We got there. It was lovely. The only problem was that we didn't have a key. He told me that the guy had left it somewhere for us to find, but hadn't specified, and since he'd only contacted him through a payphone, as he didn't have a cell phone, well, then there weren't many options. We started rummaging around the little path that led up, checking for fake rocks, under rocks, in bushes, buried in mud, and all the like. We looked for about 2 hours. and I was starting to get less and less convinced that this was true, and getting angry at my boyfriend for this. But he told me not to worry and that we will find it soon. He really did have a way with words. I grew tired of looking for the key, and went and looked at the house itself, did a perimeter check, and found that one of the upstairs windows was a little bit open. If I stood on my boyfriend's shoulders, I might be able to just touch it and crawl in perhaps. Well, after falling down twice, I just about managed to prop it open with a stick and climb my way in. It was plenty big enough for me to go through, which I was very grateful for. The cabin itself was simple enough. I got in on the upstairs part, let's call it the attic I suppose, of the cabin. It was a very nice bedroom, and I made my way down and unlocked the door. One of the things I realized when I got down is that it had 2 different locks, so even if we would have found one key, we still wouldn't have been able to get in. I was wondering at this point if my boyfriend's testimony was true, but trying to think the best of him, I unlocked the door and let him inside. We spent a really comfortable few days in the cabin. It was absolutely charming, just to be at one with nature. He was into yoga and a whole host of other interesting things as well, and at one point when he went out to get the green stuff, I was left there by myself, just trying to relax and calm down. While I was waiting all alone, as my boyfriend had already been about 3 hours at this point, I started looking around and found a book. I perched myself in the little living area on a chair and started reading, feeling quite happy with myself. That's when I see a car pull into the driveway. A really nice fancy looking car too. 4 people get out of the car. They all look about 25 to 30, with an assortment of camping and trekking gear. They start opening the door with keys, and when they open it, I give them a funny look and ask them what they think they're doing. They give me an equally puzzled look and ask me the same thing. At this point, there was no genuine confrontation, but I was starting to get afraid. But, confident that my boyfriend hadn't lied to me, and that he had in fact booked the cabin, I told them that we had booked the cabin for the week, and that my boyfriend knew the owner, and that there must be a mistake with their reservation. They told me that they had just received the keys from the owner himself, who lived about a mile away, and that there was no way he'd already booked it out. He was some 40-year-old guy, no way his memory was falling apart just yet. We gave each other quizzical looks. The guy asked where my car was, and I, not wanting to sound like I had walked here, told him that my boyfriend had gone out in the car and that he'd be back shortly. I didn't really know what else to say from embarrassment. So, with a defeated look, he said, "Come on, get in my car and we'll drive down to the owner and see him." At this point I was about soiling myself. As the confidence of these guys grew, I started to get more and more confident that my boyfriend was perhaps full of garbage and had lied to me completely, and that we had broken in and used the resources of someone else's cabin, and the guilt was weighing me down. I told him that wouldn't be necessary, that I would go speak to the owner myself when my boyfriend got here, and that perhaps we were assigned another cabin, and were given this one by mistake. That was quick thinking on my part. I didn't even know if there were any more, but the guy kind of shrugged it off and asked if in the meantime they could set up, as he was fairly confident that they were going to use this cabin. So I said sure, went upstairs and gathered our small 2 tattered backpacks and came back down. It was awkward and uncomfortable reading the book there, and at that moment is when I hear laughter coming from down the hill. I jump out the door and see my boyfriend and a few of his homeless buddies coming up. Looks like they were coming to stay as well. They had a lot of their stuff, one of them pulling a duvet behind him. When he gets to the top, he sees the car and asks where it came from. I told him that some guys were here to rent the cabin, and sweetly said that we should go check with the owner, who lives only a mile away, to see what the mix-up was about. He gives me a deadpan look and says that there must have been a mistake and la la la. That's when I catch him out. I could tell in his eyes that he had no idea that this was already rented out by someone else, and that he had basically forced me to go in and break into a cabin. I was mortified. He tells me that we'll be fine, and starts leading me down the hill, and tells me that there's another cabin and there must have been a mix-up. I grab my backpack, very upset. But there was something off about my boyfriend. It was like the fact that I had challenged him that had really irritated him. Him and his buddies were starting to display a lot more bravado than usual, and I was getting uncomfortable. They were telling nasty jokes, saying nasty words and calling me names, all banterously, apparently. That's when they got to a little brook. My boyfriend then looked at me dead in the eyes and slapped me in the face. I was shocked. No one had ever hit me like that before. Just when I was about to say what I thought of him and give him a piece of my mind, did I feel 2 hands push me square in the chest, and I fell straight, backpack and all, into the brook. He said that I should never speak to him that way, and called me all manner of horrible things. Said that I needed to learn my lesson, and him and his buddies laughed heartily and walked further into the woods. I dragged myself out of the water, crying, clueless as to where I was and where they'd gone, with little intention of following them. So I did the only logical thing. I went up to the cabin and spoke to the guys who were in there, told them the truth, that I'd run away from home, that my homeless boyfriend was a piece of work who I was pretty much done with now, and that I really would appreciate a ride home as I had no idea where I was or what I was doing. I was lucky enough that the girlfriend gave me a lift home. Turns out I was only 40 minutes away, lucky for me. My parents gave her money for gas and a little extra and thanked her when I got home safe. Something important to note is that I had actually left my cell phone in the house, as I didn't want to be part of my parents' system or use anything they had given me, other than clothes, when I left with him. That was part of his doing. I'm glad to say that I learnt my lesson about going and getting in with the wrong crowd, and my life has gone pretty well since then. One thing, I never saw him again, but I did read about him in the local paper a few years back. He apparently had gotten into a lot of trouble with some dangerous people and was on the run, and his mugshot was also available in some shops for petty theft. Looks like he never straightened out. Shame, really. A while back, me and my partner were backpacking/hitchhiking around Germany, with our eventual goal being Berlin. We got there pretty fast, seeing as we didn't have any money at all, living off donations of people who picked us up on the way to Berlin. Having no money meant sleeping in a tent in the streets. We were planning on staying in Berlin for a while, so we decided that we could take the opportunity to sleep in different spots in the city every night. Now, one of those nights turned out to become one of the most disturbing experiences of our lives. We were pretty tired, as most of our days in Berlin pertained to walking around the city most of the time, checking out places to sleep, and we eventually settled for a place in the middle of the city, next to a bridge crossing a river. We pitched our tent and had dinner. After that, I started to feel real anxious about the place we chose for the night, so after looking around I found several harrowing needles around our campsite. We sat down and started talking about leaving that place. We were both really tired, but also really uncomfortable with the place that we were staying in now. So while my partner was looking up other places to stay that were more comfortable, like a city park, I started getting a weird deja vu feeling. A feeling that the choice we were about to make would be an extremely important one. My partner found a park, and I was just glad that we could leave, so we packed our tent and started heading towards the park known as Rixerdorfen horror. By the time we arrived at what we now found was a forested hill, it was already dark. We headed up thinking we would get some privacy somewhere high on the hill. After a climb, somewhere half up, we found an open place, which under any normal given circumstance would have been perfect. Only I did not feel safe there at all. By now I was feeling such a drag to my partner, but the type of anxiety I was feeling was one I'd never felt. I started scouting around the place, and the source of my anxiety became clear. On the path up to our clearing, I saw something I can only describe as someone staring at us from a distance. I was paralyzed, just staring at this man. After composing myself, I convinced my partner to not take this place, but instead to head higher up. While climbing, I tried to tell him what I'd seen, but also that I didn't think the thing I saw was human, and tried to convey that the fear I felt was of a paranormal kind. He believed me, but it was also scaring him a bit. But we kept heading upwards. Eventually we reached the top of the hill, where there was a huge clearing decorated with steel stones in a circle of some kind. I still felt really on edge, so I didn't want to pitch the tent immediately. I wanted to calm myself down first, so I told my partner I was going to meditate, and asked him if he wanted to meditate with me as well. I tried meditating, but I was too scared to close my eyes. After some time of not meditating, but really just staring at the tree line, I gave up, and just looked around the place we were at. The first thing that caught my eye was a tree separate from all the others, somewhat in the middle of the clearing. For some reason I couldn't divert my gaze from this tree, and that's when I clearly saw it. A black figure seemingly in the tree waving its arms almost like a dance. I was having none of it. Scared, I started yelling at it to go away. That's when my partner noticed it as well, something he later described as a clear aura outline. He joined me in telling it to back off, only it didn't. Instead, I heard it approach more and more, but what I heard sounded like static, followed by a hard tick on my nose. I immediately stood up and told it harshly to piss off without fear, after which I immediately apologized as to not anger whatever the hell we encountered. We picked up our bags and practically ran down the hill, totally forgetting about our tiredness, and just kept running, and kept talking to the forest, thanking the spirit for the encounter, and telling it I wouldn't seek contact and confirmation of further proof of existence of spirits anymore. I kind of felt like a crazy person, but the shared experience told me I wasn't going insane. We kept running, and nearly down the hill my partner stepped into a big pile of horse poo, which lightened the mood almost immediately. While me coming to the hasty conclusion that this was all an elaborate joke of some trickster. We safely made it out the park, but the experience was one I'll never forget. We ended up sleeping in Mariana Platz, close to where the other hobos set up camp as well, and where half the place is squatted by punkers. So now the reason for posting this story. Have you guys ever heard of this place? Maybe people in Berlin who can check it out themselves? I don't think the entity we encountered was evil per se. I'm just quite sad about how I handled the situation. I have the feeling perhaps I could have communicated with what it was, but sadly I've left Berlin now. And also, it's way over my head when it comes to that stuff. Let me know if any of you have been that way and have felt something similar. My grandpa was always a big hunter. It's not uncommon here in the Midwest. He would always find new areas to hunt and get permission to hunt on private properties. So one day him and his buddy got permission to go on this private land that I believe was around 100 acres total. I don't recall the specifics of exactly where the forest was, but if this opens a can of worms, I'll ask for specifics. I know for a fact it was in Michigan/Indiana, the border area. In other words, Michiana. Anyway, they set out around noon to get to the forest and arrived at around 1 p.m. and started hiking back in the woods. They each had their own tree stands/blinds set up prior, so they made their way to them. I remember my grandpa telling me he hiked a few miles back, so they had been deep in the forest. As the day goes on, they don't see any deer, and once the sun begins to set, they decide to start making their way back to the truck and meet up near my grandpa's tree stand/blind. So this is where something weird happens. They're making their way back, and the sun has completely set. Luckily, they brought flashlights for the walk back, because they had to walk a few miles in the pitch dark. They finally have about a mile left of hiking when they see something crouched in front of them, with their backs turned to them. My grandpa and his friends stopped dead in their tracks, staring at this random dude in the woods at night. My grandpa described him as a bald white guy, wearing a black and white striped shirt. My grandpa and his friend speak up at that moment, and they want to ask him what he's doing out there. But without a word, the man stands up and faces them, staring at them, and then levitates up towards the tree and vanishes. After that, they sprinted to the truck and never went back to the land again. It's not the craziest story, and I know it sounds weird as hell, but I know for a fact my grandpa experienced this. He's not a liar, and it's not his kind of interest to just tell scary campfire stories that are made up to us grandkids. Whenever he would tell me the story, you could see it in his face. It was something that had disturbed him to his core. It's not something he fabricated at all. I'm here to ask if anyone has ever seen or encountered anything like it. I'd love to talk about it with anyone who knows. My mum and I were camping in our local national park in the Alps. I had a headache and had had a rough night. My mum, who I thought had slept well, hadn't. The next morning she told me about a dream she had, and that it was very realistic and it scared her. She thought she heard men talking outside our tent in a foreign language and thought that we were going to be in trouble, being that we were two women alone in the middle of nowhere. Then she saw a woman walk slowly just next to our tent while looking at us in a kind of farm outfit. Next thing she saw was a whole lot of people dressed in white in trenches just being there. I will add that this national park was back in the day the site of a world war, and that there are many abandoned buildings from the war in this area still. Sometime after, she was looking at where we were at on Google, and saw that there was a single flashing dot on the exact spot where we slept. Tonight, we're looking for it again, but it's not there anymore. I didn't feel anything in particular that night, and I did not think that my mum was having just a bad dream. Could it have been sleep paralysis? It's a very strange experience. A couple of years ago, I did a bicycle tour from Eugene, Oregon to Lagunitas, California, just north of San Francisco. To save money, I would typically drag my rig into the woods of a nearby national forest and do dispersed camping for free. I was on a shoestring budget, to say the least. If you know the basic geography of that part of Oregon, you know I had to bike from Eugene through the coastal range and meet the Pacific coast, which I would then follow down to my final destination. However, once I reached the coast, in order to keep finding free camping, I would inevitably have to venture inland, into the woods most nights, sometimes as far as 15 miles. Now, I've spent a significant amount of time outdoors in remote areas, out west in the upper Midwest, where I was raised. I'm familiar with the sometimes eerie silence the woods can take on when you're truly in the middle of nowhere, or the heightened vigilance that it brings on. However, I have never before felt an oppressive, dark, and dreadful energy in my environment like I did alone in the woods in southwest Oregon. The feeling of wrongness was a common occurrence when I stopped somewhere to evaluate a campsite. I often felt a strong sense of claustrophobia in these woods, and often felt that I was not alone. A strong feeling of paranoia became a nightly feature on that leg of the trip, and my sleep schedule suffered considerably. Keep in mind, I was stone cold sober on this tour. Somehow I powered on and I never saw any sort of creature nor entity. But I still can't shake the feeling there is something evil lurking within those forests. Once again, I'll emphasize that I am well traveled in the US, experienced in the outdoors, and have never once felt a sensation like that anywhere I've ever been.